I invite you to turn to your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 13. We're in the last chapter of Nehemiah, and I would title this chapter Nehemiah Returns. And I'll explain that in just a moment. But first, I want you to see this memory verse. Are you ready? Nehemiah 13 through 14. And I made treasuries over the treasuries, treasurers over the treasuries. Shelemiah the priest and Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites Tobiah, and next to them was Hanan the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were counted faithful in their office, was to distribute over their brethren. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offenses thereof. Look at verse 13. And we read that in class this morning, and Georgia said, "What were they thinking?" And I'm proud of our children. We're going to be familiar with this. I'm not sure what blanks will be in that verse. I don't want memory work to be busy work. Now 14 is a good verse to remember. Be familiar with verse 13. And I'm not going to worry too much about those memory verses. I guess it's hard to pick good memory verses out of this, but maybe they could have picked something else. But here's the one we've got. I didn't pick them. But there's our memory verse for the Bible Bowl. But now let's get to this story about Nehemiah returns. On that day, that's what it says in the opening verse of verse 1, Nehemiah 13. What day is that? Well, you're reading down through and you remember that the Bible's not divided into chapters as it was written in the Old Hebrew. And so you're reading down through chapter 12 and you read on that day. It'd be easy to think that on that day refers to the day in chapter 12. But by what it describes is what happens on that day, makes it sound like on that day really refers to the day or the time that we're reading about in Nehemiah chapter 13. Let me explain what happened. And some of this is going to come out as we get further into this chapter. Nehemiah had heard from his brother in chapter 1 how the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed and the city lay in waste. And it grieved him, and he went to God in prayer, looking for that time to come and present this before the king. And being the king's cupbearer, he had that audience. And the king granted him his desire to go to Jerusalem and rebuild those walls, and gave him letters showing he had that authority and approval of the king to get the materials he needed to do it, and sent him on his way. And Nehemiah came and looked at those walls for himself, and they were all torn down. And it was so bad that night, when he tried to ride his little burro around those walls, there were places the rubble was so bad that he couldn't even ride through that on his little donkey. And so he came back and presented his case to the people. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." And then they had to meet all the opposition that was coming their way from the inhabitants of the land. But they met every challenge. And the wall was built. And the people rejoiced. And they read from the book of the law. And they kept the feast in the city. And then in Nehemiah chapter 12, we read how they had that parade where they marched in two companies around that wall, came to the temple, and it looked like everything had gone so well. And then Nehemiah was summoned back to see the king. And Nehemiah obeyed that summons and returned. And then after some time, he got his leave to go back to Jerusalem. But this time, Instead of finding the city in ruins and knocked down, he saw that community in Jerusalem in ruins. And what he did, he got there and right quick, he knew, I've got to straighten this out. And you're going to see Nehemiah acting a little different in this last chapter than he had acted in those previous chapters. It's not because Nehemiah changed. It's because the situation changed. When he came to that Jerusalem the first time and saw the city in ruin, remember the people said, let us rise up and build. He had the people behind him, and he was able to lead those people that were behind him into what they wanted to have done, and they got that wall rebuilt. And remember how they made those promises and those reforms? We're going to go by the law of our God. And they even stipulated specific things that they promised they would do and signed that new commitment that they made unto the Lord. But this time he comes back, and among the very elite of those people and those who were somewhat in Jerusalem, all the way up to the high priests, they were failing to meet that commitment. And so a different time called for a different kind of leadership, and Nehemiah rose to that occasion. And we're going to see him in this chapter not so much as leading the people along as he did in the direction they wanted to go, but exercising the power of his authority to straighten this mess out. And that's what we come to in the first part of verses 1 through 3. On that day, from what it describes in those 3 verses, seem to be looking at what happens when Nehemiah returns. Now watch this. Verses 1 through 3. On that day, they read in the book of Moses of the audience of the people, and therein was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. That came to pass when they had heard the law that they separated Israel from all the mixed multitude. What was he talking about here? Back in the time when the children of Israel were coming out of wandering in that wilderness and coming up to the land, they passed by those people of Ammon and Moab. You might remember that the people of Ammon and Moab were kindred people of them, coming from the sons of Lot. And those are the people that should have been expected to welcome them with bread and water, to quench their thirst and to satisfy their hunger, and help their brethren into that promised land that the Lord had promised to give them. But instead, this fella Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel. Now this is Numbers 22 through 24. And just to remind you of this, Balaam told Balak, well, I can't do anything but say just what the Lord said unto me. And so Balak returned to Balaam and said, well, I'll give you, and he made all these promises, all these material things and riches and honors, if you'll come curse the people. He said, well, I'll ask God again. And so Balaam asked, and the Lord said, okay, go. And it's as though the Lord is saying, go ahead, make my day. You know what I want you to do. And Balaam, with his eyes glittering over all those material things he could get, material honors he got on his little donkey and he started going to curse those people. You remember the story how the donkey saw the angel with the sword drawn in the way and would turn aside and go this way. And finally Balaam got off and he was whipping his donkey, and that's when the little donkey turned around and said, hadn't I been your donkey faithful to you all these years? And Balaam, Well, the donkey said, have I ever done any wrong to you? Balaam said, nay. The little donkey's talking to Balaam, and Balaam's neighing his donkey. Isn't that something? Well, he went on, and he told Balak, well, I can't do anything but what the Lord says. He said, well, curse the people. And when the Spirit came on him, and the mouth of Balaam became the mouth of God, he spoke just what God said. And every time he opened his mouth to curse the people, it says here, our God turned the curse into a blessing. Well, because the Ammonites and the Moabites had done this thing, they were not to enter into the congregation of Israel. They could not be counted among God's people. And so after they read this in the book of the law of Moses, they must have read Numbers 22 through 24 to them. Okay, they made a separation and identified the difference between Israel and the other peoples of the land that were dwelling among them. Now Nehemiah, based on that now, Nehemiah looks up and he sees some trouble. And he sees some problems. And he's going to tend to them. And there are 4 things in this chapter that Nehemiah tends to. Number 1 has to do with the matter of Tobiah. Do you remember Tobiah? Early on in the story, when they started building the wall, and Sanballat ridiculed the Jews for building the wall. And they said, what will these feeble Jews do? Will they build the wall in a day? And then Tobiah, he's there with Sanballat. And he said, yeah, if a fox go up against that wall, it'll knock that down. That's the Tobiah we're talking about. He was in league with Sanballat and did all he could to undermine the building of that wall. But you might also remember the last we read of Tobiah after that wall was built. He was sending letters to some of those in Jerusalem. And those in Jerusalem were sending letters back to Tobiah. And Tobiah was firming up these relationships and making his connections. Well, now we have Tobiah again at the end of Nehemiah. And it says in verse 4, and before this, Elisha the priest. Now this is the high priest. Elisha the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. And he had prepared for him a great chamber, which aforetime they laid the meat offering, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and to the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priest. But in all this time I was not at Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I to the king, and after certain days obtained my leave of the king. And I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Elisha did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. That's right there in the temple. Nehemiah had gone back, and when Nehemiah left, Tobiah moved in. He moved right into the temple. Even that place where Nehemiah himself said he would not go and hide from his enemies. And now here's Tobiah right there. And it grieved me sore, Nehemiah said. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff to Tobiah out of the chamber. Get all his stuff. Throw that out of here. And get that out of here. And that's what they did. And after they cleaned house with Tobiah, he said, then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and there brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offerings and the frankincense. I think Mike said this morning, what was the word? They sanitized it? Is that the word he used? They got in there and they cleaned this place out, and then they cleaned the room up. And really what they did in cleansing it, They may have had to sweep it and scrub it like that. Any of you that have had bad renters probably understand what that would be about. But it wasn't just a bad renter here that made a mess of things. It was unclean. Because you weren't supposed to bring Tobiah into these places. And so by cleansing it, probably had to do also with the priest, purifying it and setting it apart to make it holy again. That's number one. Now number two. The portions for the Levites. See, Tobiah was right there in the room where they were supposed to keep those portions for the Levites and distribute it to the Levites. Well, they took that out, moved Tobiah in, and they weren't giving the Levites their portions. In fact, the Levites that were supposed to be there to serve the temple and take care of the temple had to go back to their own fields and work them so they could have provisions. Verse 10. Nehemiah says, I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. For the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled every one to his field. Then contended I with the rulers and said, Why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. Then brought all Judea the tithe of the corn and of the new wine and the oil unto the treasuries. Now here's that memory verse. And I made treasurers over the treasuries, Shelemiah the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites, Tobiah, and next to him was Hanan, the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah. For they were counted faithful, and their office was to distribute unto their brethren. You could count on these men. You could trust these men with this, all this portion. They were faithful. They were faithful men, reliable men, trustworthy men, able men. So he turned it over to them. And then he said this, Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for the offices thereof. Have you ever had to straighten folks out? I tell you, some of you may have done that in your work, and sometimes elders have to do this in the church. They got to come in and say, okay, this thing is gotten in a mess, and now we got to straighten it out. And that is not a pleasurable thing to do. You talk about stress. That's where you lose some sleep. Wondering how hard should I push this, and just really have to point to the wrongdoers and says, you're the one that is doing that, and you've got to stop it, and you've got to get out of there, and this person has to come in. And I tell you, when you go in there and you straighten things out like this, it is stressful. How do you deal with this stress? Nehemiah was a man of prayer. And all through the book of Nehemiah, we've been seeing him pray. And Nehemiah takes this before God. Now, I imagine Tobiah and Elishabib and some of these others that have been responsible for this mess weren't too happy with Nehemiah by this time. But Nehemiah wasn't here to make them happy. He was here to serve God. And so he makes this prayer. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for the offices thereof. And we're told in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, that God is not unfaithful, but He remembers the good that we have done. Nehemiah had already prayed that prayer once. And he's going to pray that prayer in this chapter 3 times. Now, number 3. We got more problems. This time we've got to deal with the Sabbath. You remember how they had promised, they'll keep the Sabbath. They won't do business on the Sabbath. They promised they would do that. Look at this. Verse 15. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath. and bringing in sheaves, and ladening asses. Also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Then I testified against them in that day wherein they sold victuals. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Let me tell you about that word profane. The word profane means to treat something that is holy as though it is common. And the Sabbath day was set apart from the days of the week to be holy. Well, they're treating it just like every other day, going about their business, buying and selling and harvesting and processing their grapes. And verse 18, Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants I set at the gates, that there should be no burden brought in on the Sabbath day. We'll put a stop to that. We're going to shut the gates, and I'm going to have men there to make sure people don't go in and out of those gates. And then 20, so the merchants and the sellers and all kind of ware lodge without Jerusalem once or twice. While they're coming up, and they can't go in the gates, so they'll stay just outside the city and take care of their business there. Well, here's what Nehemiah did. Then I testified against them and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay my hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. And then that prayer, Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. There's another problem, and this one gets personal. And this is always a tough thing to deal with. And this had to do with their marriages. You see, what they had done is they had married among the people of the land. They had taken their sons and given it to their daughters, and taken their daughters and given them to their sons, and did exactly what God said not to do in regard to who to marry. They were to marry within the people of Israel. Now, if someone like Ruth, remember Ruth the Moabitess, well, didn't Boaz marry her? Yes, but Ruth had adopted the religion of the Jews and was worshiping Jehovah according to that when she said to Naomi, Thy God be my God. But if they were going to stay worshiping their idols and going their own way, God did not want His people marrying that. Because you know, who you marry has so big an influence on who you become. And He was afraid, God knew really, that these heathen people that the children of Israel married would bring them away from God and into their idolatry. Well, now that's a tough one to deal with. But Nehemiah dealt with it. In those days saw I Jews had married the wives of Ashdod and Ammon and of Moab, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak the Jews' language, but according to the language of these people. I've heard some sermons in my day about the language of Ashdod. I mean, they had married these people that spoke a different language, and the children had picked up the language of both parents and had the language all mixed up and couldn't even speak the Jews' language. Now, the law of God was in the Jews' language, but they weren't speaking that language. The language of Ashdod comes. When you get these fellas and they go out, and instead of studying the Bible and preaching God's Word, what they do, they study a bunch of denominational books, and before long they're talking like the books they study. And you begin to hear it in their speech. And it gets to where they can't speak as the oracles of God. They're speaking the language of Ashdod and using the language of denominational theologians instead of the language of the prophets. When the language starts to sound strange, beware lest the doctrine begins to sound strange. And that's the sermon that's preached about the language of Ashdod. Well, we read here in verse 25, I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair. Sounds like Nehemiah was really upset here. It grieved him, didn't it? And it says, I made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons or for yourselves. Didn't Solomon the king sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him who was beloved of his God. And God even made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. And you know well that story of Solomon, who took many, many wives, and how he built in Jerusalem temples and shrines to the gods of his wives. And God was not pleased. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God and marrying strange wives? And this is how bad it got. One of the sons of Joadiah, the son of Elisha the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Haronite. Therefore I chased him from me. Even among the high priest and his grandson, they had done that. And Nehemiah said, get him out of here. I chased him away from me. If you're going to do that, you have no part then in the things having to do with Israel. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. This time he said, you remember them. They're the ones that had defiled the way. In verse 30, thus cleansed I them from all strangers, and appointed the wards of the priests and of the Levites, every one in his business, and for the wood offering at times appointed, and for the first fruits. And then Nehemiah's prayer. Remember me, O my God, for good. And that's how the story of Israel closes in the Old Testament. In the Wednesday nights to come, after we do this Wednesday night and our singing, I'll go into the prophet Malachi, because Malachi comes about this time and we can infer some things about Israel's history from the preaching of that prophet Malachi, the very last prophet in the Old Testament. And that'll bring the Old Testament to a close. But it doesn't look like a good end for Israel here, does it? I mean, from the time they came out of Egypt and started murmuring because they didn't have their onions and they didn't have their water they wanted to drink. And God bore with that rebellious people all those years. And time again, they would reform and then turn away from Him and turn away. And right here at the end, they were trying to turn away again. And Nehemiah, he's one of the great heroes of the Old Testament. The study of Nehemiah is a great study in leadership. And those first part of Nehemiah, he is leading people where they want to go, because that's where they ought to go. And he does so well in that. And then at the latter end of Nehemiah in this chapter, he is keeping the people from going where they want to go because they're about to go wrong. And he has to come back and straighten this mess out. Now, Nehemiah was an old man by the time he was doing this upon his return. But how well we remember Nehemiah for good. And you know that the Lord remembers Nehemiah for good as well. Well, there's a lot to learn from that chapter, and we'll have our test over that. But let's just be so careful that when we commit to God and say, I'm going to turn back to Him, that we keep that commitment. We don't need to have some Nehemiah come and straighten us out, but that we keep those promises and keep that covenant and keep that commitment faithful to the end. If any of you have not been faithful, you know you can always come back, and so we have that opportunity when we extend this invitation. And if you hadn't been baptized into Christ, then you can do that as well tonight as we stand and sing this invitation song.